Chapter 1, A New World. Now, if you were taking an online course, this is pretty much what you would have. I record my lectures that I give in class and show them on the web. So we're going to get started with Chapter 1. And the first Americans who came over migrated out of Asia over the Bering Strait, as we talked about in the first lecture. And although at once upon a time they were saying it was 12,000 years ago, we found artifacts that are a lot older than that. So now we're given a broad category between 15 and 60,000 years ago. That they came over and they were migrated down between North, Central, and South America. They were called Paleo-Indians, although, in my opinion, they were Asian immigrants. And when they got here, they, of course, they're following the warmth, they're following food, they're hunter-gatherers, and before you know it, even though they were hunting the bison and the woolly mammoth, it didn't take them long before you're almost hunting them to extinction. And during the gathering, they would also gather nuts and berries, but before you know it, with little game to be hunted, they begin to develop agriculture, and they develop maize, which of course we know is corn, squash, and beans. And they would plant the squash and beans in between the corn stalks. With less having to move around hunting and gathering, the agricultural movement began to spread, and soon there was very little moving, and civilizations began to develop in little villages that began to settle. Now this is the map, as I said, that it shows you how they came across. Some of them came just down to here, Baja, but an awful lot of them, as you can see, they were following, the glaciers are beginning to recede. So they're following them on down into Mexico, Central America, and South America. And of course, this is what we call Mesoamerica. This is where the large majority was. But the Indian societies of the Americans, as pointed out in the first lecture, that these people were not heathens running around with no clothes on and a bow and arrow killing each other. They had culture, they had cities, they had roads, they had irrigation and trade networks, architecture. Some even had inside running water and inside plumbing. But because they had no metal tools, they had no machines or no use of the wheel, they didn't know what gunpowder was, and they, of course, had no navigational knowledge of the sea or a written language. According to the European standard for civilization, they were heathens. And of course, they also had no resistance to European diseases. Now, the North American Indians, as we've already discussed the South Americans a little bit, the Mississippi River Valley Indians, they're called mound builders, and they started out settling on the Mississippi River, which starts at the Gulf of Mexico. And they built a series of what they call semicircular mounds. They had extensive trade networks throughout the continent. We have some artifacts from as far away as Michigan. And in the northeastern Arizona area, the Hopi and the Zuni lived in villages. They had irrigation and dams and canals and trade work, but over time they declined. And the Spanish called these people the Pueblo Indians. But the Pacific coast was very densely populated. They had hundreds of independent groups of natives who lived predominantly by fishing and hunting. And some of those Indians would form confederacies to work together. On the Great Plains, the Great Plains, you know, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, that's the flattest land I've ever seen in my life. I lived in Kansas for a number of years, and believe me, it's hot and flat. They had very little agriculture going on, so they did more hunting of buffalo. And they used every part of the buffalo, from the tail for thread to the skin they used for teepees or for clothes. They'd lose the meat, the tongue, and they'd use every part of it. And in the eastern North America, of course, you've got the Choctaw, the Cherokee, and the Chickasaw, the Iroquois. There again, they're hunting and gathering and fishing and agriculture, and they traded with each other. And occasionally there'd be war between them, but never over land. It may be over a hunting ground, but never over land, because land was never an issue. But when the Europeans arrived, they found that it seemed like each different tribe had a different language. They had their customs, and their political systems were different, if you could call it that, according to them. Their religions were different among the tribes, and they just couldn't seem to make the connection between France and England were different. So why wouldn't they be? and to destroy the myth totally of the virgin land. As you can see, by 1500, North America was completely socked in with Indians. They're all over the place. And not that it matters a hill of beans, but there is one tribe here called the Creek Indians. Now, they and a bunch of them here were, of course, moved west during the Trail of Tears, which we'll study later. But once upon a time, back about 1920 or so, a fellow from Texas was traveling north to get to the Kansas Territory, and he went through an Indian reservation, the Creek Indian Reservation, and he saw this pretty little Indian gal, and he married her. So my husband is half Creek and half Texan. Not the shit. That will not be my test. Now, Mr. John White was, of course, a very famous artist, which you'll learn more about when you learn about the Lost Colony, too. But to me, I've never ceased to be amazed at the detail. Now, granted, these Indians look a little bit more white than they probably are, but look at their arms and legs, and it's just phenomenal, the abilities that they had. But the Native American religion, now, this is something else that the Europeans had trouble understanding. All the religions and their practices seem to be related to farming and hunting. And they had a tendency to invest non-living things with spiritual power, like totem poles. And they always had a single boss. Now, just like we have, if you're Christian, you have Yahweh as your supreme boss. They had a single top boss, and then they had little minor bosses below. But the one thing that caused the biggest amount of problem was land. The Europeans made no effort to understand their culture, but when it came to land, they thought that the Indians were not taking proper care of it, because the land was not privately owned. It was communally based and used for the entire tribe. And as long as you could grow things on it and feed your family, you were welcome to use the land. But once you would no longer use it, you weren't supposed to be using it at all. They said, you can't own the air you breathe. How can you own land? Well, the Europeans want that little piece of paper that says it's a deed, it's mine, I'm going to put a fence around it, and you can't use it. So right off the bat, we got big problems. And then there's problems with the sexes. In Europe, it's very much patrilineal and very patriarchal. Whereas in the Indian tribes, most of them, well, they were matrilineal, which did not mean that the woman was the chief. It just simply meant that the power came through the female side of the family. You had to have a good marriage, and when you had children, the children would be raised by the mother's family, not the father's family. If something happened to the father or the mother's family would raise the children. Women could take part in political discussions. Women could take part in selecting a chief. Whereas in Europe, women could not own property. They very definitely could not scooter poop, or as Mr. John Green is going to explain to you, he says, scooter pooping instead of sex. They couldn't have premarital sex. They couldn't get a divorce. They couldn't take care of any part of religion. Nor could they help select who was going to run them. They were the caregiver. Whereas in the Indian society, the female could take part in all these things, and also she was not only the caregiver, she was the cook, and the most important thing was she controlled the food distribution. Now, if a warrior came back and he had not done good and not hunted as well as he should have, the female Indian had the right to withhold food from him. So anytime you control the food, you've got a powerful position. And in the Indian society, the men were political. They were the leaders. They hunted. They did warfare. They talked about things like that. And the woman took care of the children and the family and the food. And everybody was perfectly happy with this arrangement, except the Europeans. The Europeans first thought, well, maybe they're just noble savages, or better yet, they're probably uncivilized barbarians. And, of course, that negative idea carried through. They had lack of religion or Christianity. They did not make use of their land because it was communal and nobody owned it. And they let their women do all this crazy things like scooter pooping when they weren't married. So because of this, the English and the French and the Dutch, they could justify exploration. Because the men were lazy. They were just out hunting and fishing. And the only people in Europe that had time to hunt and fish were the upper class. The poor man had to be out working in the fields while the woman was at home tending to the kids. And in America, it wasn't that way. The men fished and hunted. The women worked in the fields. But this was not the European way. So the Europeans looked and they didn't see any kind of government, any kind of legal system. They thought the Indians had no respect for authority and they had no discipline, they thought. And they just did not take the time to understand what was going on. Whereas in Europe, freedom meant you could own your own property. That was freedom. Whereas in the Americas, to the Indian, the commitment to the family and the community was the most important thing. You believed in self-deprivation and mutual obligations. You took care of the group, took care of everybody, not just yourself. Whereas, again, in Europe, they believed in freedom was a collection of rights and privileges, which everybody did not partake of. It was for a small, elect few. And, of course, if you were a Christian, and Christian liberty, it meant subordinating yourself to the Christian God. Now, each country in Europe had their own established church. The leader of the country decided what religion you were going to be a member of. And sometimes they used it to bandy back and forth to make treaties with other countries, but you're subordinating yourself to a God that someone else has chosen. And sometimes it would suppress religious groups, sometimes non-religious groups. But according to the Europeans, liberty depended on obedience to law and knowing your place in society. Now, I don't know how many of you have living grandparents, but I'm sure if you do, you've heard them at one time or another say, "Just who do you think you are?" And they don't realize that what they're doing is they're fussing at you for acting like in the wrong station of life. Excuse me. Because kings were the divine rule. They were the same thing all the way down at patriarchal. The father was the king of the family, and his children and his womenfolk and his slaves were all his subjects. And European women could not vote. If they did have a job, they could not control their wages. Their husband picked them up. They couldn't write a will. They couldn't get a divorce. And if there was a divorce, the husband was given custody of the children. But owning land, this was the key in Europe. Owning land. If you owned land, you could vote, which means you're part of the political process. If you owned land, you could support your family. If you owned land, you were important to the community. I apologize for my dog. Now, freedom of religion or speech is an oxymoron, basically, because they talk about this great freedom of speech. What they're talking about is it started in England where you were allowed to say anything you needed to say or wanted to say in Parliament. But if you said it outside of Parliament, you could be arrested for treason or heresy. And, of course, if you defied your employer, you could suffer criminal penalties because you were breaking a contract. Yet each one of these crazy countries over there, they claim they're colonizing because they're trying to spread freedom. And what they're really after is what I call the 3 G's: God, gold, and glory. And they were looking for the shortcut to the Spice Islands to cut out that Muslim middleman trade. In reality, it was probably more gold, glory, and God, but we'll go with the book. God, gold, and glory. Now, the China had sent huge fleets from the west to the east coast of Africa, and they could have gone further, but your text says they're not interested. But we saw that little film, remember, Xing He? It wasn't so much that they weren't interested, that once he died, the new ruler decided he didn't want to be involved in world trade. Well, the white man didn't have anything they wanted, really. And the white man, they thought the white man stank because he ate meat and he had a different body odor. So they really didn't have anything, the white man didn't have anything he wanted. Patches! Patches! Now, Portugal and West Africa. Well, Portugal is a very small, tiny little piece of land to the west of Spain. And the nice thing about Portugal, at this time, she was one of the few countries in the entire continent, Europe, that had a stable government. And when you've got a stable government, you have some time and money to explore. And the Portuguese turned out to be excellent navigators. Even Prince Henry, the heir to the throne, although he didn't know how to paddle the ship himself, he built schools for navigators. He paid bonuses to get people to come in to teach them how to sail. And they began to sail down the west coast of Africa. And they established small colonies, or, well, colonies is the wrong word. more military outposts or refueling stations. And they traded with the Africans. And yes, they traded in slaves. But here again, you've got to realize this is not a slavery based on race or color. Uh, Africa had had slavery for thousands of years. It was because you were either could not pay your bill, or more than likely you'd been in a war and you'd been captured. It was not disgraceful to be a slave. And if you were a slave and you had a child, the child was not born a slave, and you could marry into the family. There were many ways you could get out of being a slavery. And they were treated with respect. So in all honesty, I think that the people who sold the first slaves to the Portuguese really thought that the Portuguese would treat their slaves the same way they did. But that did not turn out to be. So the Portuguese established sugar plantations, and based on slavery, because there's a very small Portuguese population and nobody wanted to leave Portugal, so they had to have their slaves to do the work. But by 1498, just a few years after Columbus had crossed that great Atlantic Ocean, they had already explored the Indian coast, and they had trading posts in Africa and India and southern China and Indonesia. They were very, very powerful and wealthy. As you can see, look at this. I've gone all the way around the island. I mean, the continent of Africa, and down in through here, all the winds and the tides and the waves are terrible. But look how big the Sahara Desert is. If you ever get a chance to take Black History, do, because once upon a time, this was green and lush. And of course, in through here is where we're going to get most of the American slaves from, and it's going to be called the Gold Coast and the Ivory Coast and all through here. But this little bitty sliver of land, look at this. I can imagine selling out of sight of land. They had to really be brave. And then you have Christopher Columbus. Now, he was an experienced mariner from Genoa. He was not Italian. He also did not believe the earth was flat. But he believed he could get to India by sailing west. And he underestimated the distance of the Atlantic Ocean, and he overestimated the distance he was going to travel. He had the right idea, just the wrong figures. But he had a hard time getting support because money wasn't that easy to come by. And once you sail out of sight of land, I mean, those monsters might get you. But King Ferdinand and Queen Isabel, who just recently married and combined several of the provinces of Spain, they just had a war with the Moors, or the Muslims, and managed to kick them out. And they were short of money, because it takes money to run a kingdom. So they agreed to take a gamble. I mean, if he was successful, well, Katie barred the door. But I mean, if he didn't make it, well, it was a gamble. So they agreed to finance him. In 33 days, 1492, he arrived in what we call the Bahamas, which he called La Hispaniola. And he returned to Spain with the natives, whom he called Indians, because he thought he'd hit the Indian coast. I think he died thinking he really had. A year later, he took his second trip, and it was on the second trip that we began to see the startings of the Spanish colonization of the New World and exploitation. But there is so much gold and silver and diamonds and turquoise and stuff floating back across the sea to Spain that England and France and Portugal, I mean, they want a piece of that pie too. Now, of course, you studied these Spanish conquistadors when you were in school. You got Herman Cortez and Francisco Pizarro. And the flow of these riches are going back in what they call big black ships twice a year. They have something your text mentioned called the Columbian Exchange, where the Americas sent plants and animals and culture to Europe, and Europe sent plants and animals and diseases back from Europe. And there is even, well, the sailors have been blamed on spreading syphilis because they said they got it from the Indians, although it's been proven in the last few years that syphilis was something that was kind of spontaneously erupted all over the world. It didn't just happen in the New World. But by the 1500s, Spanish had an enormous global empire, and both the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans were, well, they were just highways to move people and goods for them. You've got gold and silver and jewels, all from Mexico and Peru. So how are you going to take care of all this? Well, you don't have elected assemblies. You've got bureaucrats, which are controlled by the Spanish crown. And of course, the Catholic Church is doing all the administration to the native Indians. But it didn't take long before the Spanish colonies had developed classes. These classes are going to be determined by your skin color. Now, if you were a native-born Spaniard, born in Spain, you were called a peninsular. And if you were born in the New World, even though you were Spanish, your parents were Spanish, you were second, third down. And if you were born in the New World and you married an Indian or a black, the children were mezzitos. And then there was a slave. Because the Spanish people, guys had been ordered, all the single men had been ordered to marry, but being a shortage of women, it didn't take long, but there was a lot of intermarriages. And before you know it, we have four distinct classes, as you can see with the picture. The upper left is those who were born in Spain. The one on the right is those who were Spanish born in the New World. The one on the bottom left is the ones born in the New World who have married an Indian, and the one on the right is the one who married the African American. So the darker your skin, the lower you were on the social class. And how do they justify this? Well, they're spreading Catholicism. Got to. In 1517, a young monk called Martin Luther posted a series of 95 theses or 95 objections to the church for selling indulgences. Now, I'm not going to ask you who all is Catholic. I'm going to give a very non-committal version of what an indulgence is. Basically, an indulgence is a get-out-of-purgatory-free card. You can be forgiven for a sin that you haven't committed yet if you pay the right money to the church. Now, Spain was the most Catholic of all Catholic countries. And when we're starting to see, because if you look at the word Protestantism, let me show you. Look at P-R-O-S-T-E-S-T, and just forget this for a minute. That's protest. That's basically what Martin Luther was doing. He was protesting the selling of indulgences. He wasn't trying to start a new religion. But, of course, there was others who picked up on it. And to stop this spread of Protestantism or protests, you needed to convert some Indians to the true faith. Got to save those souls of those Indians so you have a good workforce. Now here you see the voyages of what we call discovery, and you see very few up this way. All out of Spain. And right here is Sebastian. And believe it or not, Portugal's the one that's going to come down through here. But it's going to be Magellan, who was all the way around the tip of South America. There's not a heck of a lot going on right here, right now. It's right in here. Mesoamerica. That's where all the good stuff is. In 1537, Pope Paul II outlawed Indian enslavement. And a Dominican priest called Las Casas, he's complaining of the Indian cruelty at the hands of the Spanish, and they were very cruel. He said the only justification for any empire building was simply to convert the Indians to the true faith. And he wrote a book called his Black Legend, which would be used against the Spanish by the French and the English over and over again, saying this is why we're really going over there. We're trying to save the Indian from the horrors of the Spanish. A couple of years later, they established something called the repartmento system, where the Indians would be paid a wage, and they couldn't be sold. So legally they were free, but they were required to perform labor, and they were still mistreated. But treatment did improve over time, but it was slow. So the Spanish Empire really included Mexico, Peru, and the West Indies. And although they were all up into New Mexico and into the area we call Texas and Louisiana, they didn't really have a lot of settlements. Juan Ponce de Leon went to Florida trying to find that fountain of youth and got killed by the Indians before he found it. Juan Rodriguez Cabela, he traveled as far as Oregon. It just amazes me. And I know when we lived in Kansas, we used to think it was quite exciting when we'd find either seashells or a Spanish artifact of some kind out in the middle of a field in the middle of Kansas. But they went everywhere. And of course, Coronado went through the interior of the Western Plain, and they took with them diseases, but they didn't find any gold. That's just a table giving you the estimates. In North America, the estimated population, as you can see, Mexico had the largest. And the Andes right behind them with South America. Hispaniola, they had 1 million, but they didn't last long. Now, Spanish Florida wanted a base to combat the pirates that were threatening the black ships, because why would you go to all the trouble of digging gold and stuff when you can capture one Spanish black ship and your family and your country can live off of the profits of it for a decade? So the French come up with this idea that they're going to have a settlement in North Carolina, or the area called North Carolina. And King Charles was the king of France at the time. So they send a bunch of guys over with no intention of settlement, nothing to plant, no settlers. They're strictly opposed, and they're going to use that as a base to go out and attack the black ships. Well, it didn't take long for the Spanish to find out what's going on, so the Spanish simply attacked Fort Carolina and destroyed the fort and killed everybody that was there. So to prevent this from happening again, they decided they better establish another base. So that's why they established St. Augustine, so they could be closer to the eastern coast. And they started sending priests and men out all up and down the northeast coast, all the way up to South and North Carolina. And the plan was to convert the Indians, but the Indians just were not very receptive. But they did keep an eye out for any Spanish or any French or any English. Spanish in the Southwest, there was no gold. Explorers were killed by Indians, and brutal retaliation. You kill a Spaniard and you got it. Oh, man. Now, this is called a Sky City as it appeared in 1904. And archaeologists still aren't for sure why they built them up so high. Was it to prevent enemies? Was there floods during that time? It just doesn't make any sense because they're so hard to get to. As you can see, you got steps out a little bit of it. It just didn't make any sense why you'd have them up that high. But there's a thing called the Pueblo Revolt. Now, as the Inquisition is intensifying in Spain, the local priests in the New World are also intensifying their efforts to convert the Indians, and they got really carried away. They started burning all the Indians' idols. They burned their masks, their sacred objects. And while they're doing this, the Navajo and the Apache Indians are also attacking the local Indians, and there's a drought. So the Indians are being hit with three prongs. The persecution from the priests, the other Indians attacking them, and drought. So the Pueblo people are a little bit divided. And one guy from the Pueblo people called Popey, he organized an uprising to drive out the Spanish. And it was successful. They killed over 400 Spanish settlers and 21 missionaries. So the Spanish decided to abandon the area, which was called Santa Fe, New Mexico at the time, for a while. And then they went on a rampage. They wanted to destroy anything, any vestige of the Spanish. They killed the fruit trees. They killed the Spanish cattle. They destroyed the churches. They rebuilt their old churches of worship. And they went into the river to wash away their baptism. But, people can't get along, and warfare breaks out among the tribes of the Navajo and the Apache. And they take advantage of it, and then Popey dies. And once this happens, Spain said, and they come back in with both barrels. But as you can see, look how far up they went. You got Fort Caroline, just right there in South Carolina, St. Augustine. We haven't got Roanoke here yet. That doesn't happen just yet. But actually, Roanoke isn't that far up. But all in through here, it's just amazing to me, the explorations that people did on horses and with their 2 feet. Now, India in 1500 had 110 million people. China, 103. Western Europe, only 57. The Americans, 54. As you can see, the world at that time was less than 500 million people. Majority of them in India and China. Now, other countries wanted material wealth from the New World. And they're using the excuse that Spain's treatment of the Indians is horrible. So the French began by looking for the fabled Northwest Passage, a river all the way from the Atlantic to the Pacific so we could get to the Spice Islands. But they ended up settling in Canada, and they established colonies all along the Mississippi River, and they claimed all of the Ohio River Valley. Now, France was a little bit different. She treated the Indians with some respect. They traded with them, they signed treaties with them, they lived in their villages, they ate their food, they married their women. And even the Jesuit priests, even though they were a little bit rough, they tried to convert, but they were a little bit more tolerant of the native religions than some of the ones further south were. And the one thing they did not do, they did not exploit the Indian labor. But there again, they brought with them diseases. And the local Indians, whether they liked it or not, were getting drawn into what we call continental wars because you've got France in the north, Spain in the south, and by this time you've got the English along the coast, you've got the Netherlands there, and you've got these countries that are not getting along well in Europe. They're sure not going to get along well in the New World. So as you can see, all of this green is what France is claiming. You've got this little bit of area here called the New Netherlands. England is still claiming just along the coast, and just a few miles along the coast, and all the rest of this Spain is claiming. Now, Henry Hudson had explored the New York Harbor and river, and of course it was named for him. In 1542, New Amsterdam was established, and of course you learned about New Amsterdam and Peter Stuyvesant and all that good stuff in grade school. But the Netherlands in Europe became the center of culture and enlightenment and a huge maritime trade empire. They were very successful, very good with trade. They invented the Joint Stock Company, which England's going to take advantage of when she starts settling in the New World. And they had a lot of freedoms that the rest of the countries didn't have, but it wasn't democratic. It was ruled by a business, the West India Company. But the irony is the Dutch slaves, especially in the New World, had some rights, and one of them was called half freedom. For instance, if I own a slave and I haven't got enough to do to keep him busy all year, I'll let him go into town and work. And I might let him keep all his money, I might let him pay me some back. But chances are I'll let him keep it everything, only as long as he agrees that if we have Indian attacks, he will come help. If we need to build a dam or a road or something, he will help. So he's half free, but he's still not totally free. And women enjoyed freedoms. They could decide who they wanted to marry and not marry, and sometimes they scoodle-pooped. There was a lot of religious toleration. As a matter of fact, the first Jewish synagogue was in New Amsterdam. So they had a lot of ethnic diversity. But the West India Company gradually loosened control because the people in Holland, they didn't want to come to the New World. And so the few that did come over began to buy up all the land, and we started having large landowners. And it seems like absolute power corrupts absolutely. And before you know it, these large landowners are being very autocratic. It's going to cause problems with the people who don't have a lot of land. And it never did become a large colony. You see, the Dutch were more interested in trade than colonies. And only recently liberated from Spanish rule and Catholic oppression, they've become, Protestant. But they recognized Indian sovereignty over the land. And they said you can't buy any land from the Indian until you've got a legal title to prove that you purchased it. Unfortunately, the different cultures did create conflicts between the Indians and the Netherlands. And eventually, because of the trade wars, England and the Netherlands went to war again. And the war with England was lost. And before you know it, England takes over New Amsterdam. And I have a video that at the end of this that gives you the history of New Amsterdam, as well as how it metamorphoses from New Amsterdam into the New York and the New World. So this begins a journey of the English into the New World. As I said, a history of the New Amsterdam settlement, the English takeover, and slavery. So I want you to watch this YouTube and take a break and work your short quiz.
On September 2nd, 1609, an English explorer hired by the Dutch to find a faster route to the riches of the Orient steered his 80-ton ship off the surging currents of the North Atlantic and into an immense sheltered bay. Sailing to the mouth of the mile-wide river that flowed into it from the north, he pushed 100 miles upstream, hoping it led to China. It didn't. But though he had failed to find the Northwest Passage, Henry Hudson had stumbled upon something even better. One of the biggest and best natural harbors in the world. A safe haven, one fellow explorer said, wherein 1,000 ships may ride in safety. Of all the early explorers, Hudson was the first to sense the immense potential of the remote and lonely harbor.
New York is the finest harbor in the Atlantic Ocean. To start there. And just as harbor, but it's so much more. It's an entrance into North America.
New York cannot be understood aside from this geography. Indeed, no city could. And then what's key is that the very heart of New York is an island, Manhattan. So that the Indians, who were not in most places in the United States in the early 17th century, were on the island of Manhattan because it was a natural location for a great city.
As soon as they saw the sails of Hudson's ship, the local inhabitants, who called themselves the Lenape, rowed out to meet them, trying to keep pace with the strange-looking vessel as it made its way across the bay. 28 canoes, full of men, women, and children, one of Hudson's officers reported, seeming very glad of our coming. 15 years later, in the spring of 1624, the first boatload of colonists arrived to establish a permanent presence in the harbor, spurred on by Hudson's glowing reports of a fur-trading paradise, and eager to beat out their arch-rivals, the English, to the spoils of the North American continent. It was a business proposition from the very start. From one end to the other, the new colony was owned and operated by a giant corporation called the Dutch West India Company, the Atlantic wing of a vast trading empire that stretched round the world.
The Dutch East India Company, from which the Dutch West India Company we would call today kind of a subsidiary corporation, was one of the most successful commercial enterprises in the history of the world. For 200 years, it returned average annual profit in excess of 10%. So when we talk about the Dutch East India Company, we're not talking about some cutesy little company. We're talking about a company that was more successful and more powerful than IBM in our own time. And they anchored their North American operations on a place they call New Amsterdam.
New York was founded for no other reason than to make a buck. The Puritans came to New England in order to worship God as they saw fit. The Catholics came to Maryland, the Quakers to Pennsylvania. The Dutch came to Manhattan to get beaver skins. And so devoted were they to making a profit that they didn't get around to even building a church for 17 years. And ever since, however big the city has gotten, somewhere deep in its soul, it is always New Amsterdam, where modern capitalism was invented.
Most of the first Dutch colonists were not in fact Dutch, but French-speaking Belgian Huguenots. 110 men, women, and children in all, in 30 different families, cast-offs, hoping to make a go of it in the New World. They quickly settled on the slender island at the head of the bay, which they called Manhattan, after an old Indian word, thought by some to mean Island of Hills, and by others, place of general inebriation. At the southernmost tip, they cleared land and built simple bark cabins, a crude counting house, and a stone and earth fort. Then widened the old Indian trail that ran north from the makeshift village and named it Heerstraat, or Breedaway. It would become Broadway. Other settlements soon sprang up around the harbor, including the village of Breukelen, named for a town back in Holland, and up along the East River, a sprawling plantation owned by a Danish farmer named Jonas Bronk. It was soon known simply as the Bronx. That same year, the Director General, Peter Minute, called together the leaders of all the local tribes and made them a fateful offer. They have bought the island Manhattans from the wild men, the company accountant later reported, for the value of 60 guilders. The Dutch had, in fact, paid much more than the $24 of legend, but still less than $600 for all 14,000 acres of Manhattan real estate. The Indians, who had lived on the island since the end of the Ice Age, thought the arrangement temporary. But there were problems from the start. Though thick bales of beaver, otter, muskrat, and mink were soon being shipped back to Holland 4 times a year, the remote and lonely colony, 4,000 miles from the mother country, struggled to take hold.
People in Holland are, in fact, not terribly interested in coming here. The promoters send back these tracts about glories of this place. But, you know, the fact of the matter was that from a Dutch perspective, if you were in Amsterdam and you wanted to make your fortune out in the colonies, you went to the Spice Islands, you went to Brazil, you got into the African slave trade. Beavers was a distinctly second-rate operation. It was for second-rank merchants.
Less than 2 decades after being founded, the fledgling colony had begun to fall apart. Its population dwindling, drunkenness on the rise, and morale at an all-time low.
It's like Dodge City. I mean, every other building is a bar. It's a mud hole and sinkhole. The fort is falling down. Pigs are rooting in the foundations. We need to shake this place up. And what they do is they, like a global corporation that they were, you can sort of think of the West India Company as sort of like Exxon with guns, I mean, with its own naval fleet. They transferred a branch manager from Curacao up to New York and said, we want you to whip this place into shape. And he did.
In the spring of 1647, New Amsterdam got a new director general, a 37-year-old ex-soldier and minister's son, who had lost his right leg to a cannonball during a naval battle in the West Indies. Iron-willed, short-tempered, and puritanical, Peter Stuyvesant had strict orders to clean the place up and make it pay. I shall govern you as a father his children, he told the stubborn and unruly citizens of New Amsterdam. And it was soon apparent he meant every word he said. Within weeks of his arrival, he had banned drinking on Sundays, outlawed knife fighting in public, and imposed stiff fines for missing church, speeding on Broadway, and fornicating with the Indians. By 1653, in less than 5 years, Stuyvesant had managed to transform the disorderly backwater into a bustling town, with its own piers, canals, windmills, and schools, 300 row houses, a population of 3,000, and a 2,340-foot wall, stretching all the way from the East River to the Hudson, built to keep out hostile Indians and the English. Though it offended Stuyvesant's keen sense of order, to ease the chronic labor shortage, he reluctantly agreed to let in almost anyone willing to work. Census takers soon reported hearing a chorus of languages on the streets of New Amsterdam, including French, English, German, Spanish, Polish, and Portuguese. By 1654, the Dutch had become a minority in their own colony, and Stuyvesant himself feared that New Amsterdam would soon become too diverse to rule. On September 12, 1654, the first Rosh Hashanah service in North America was held in private in New Amsterdam. It was the beginning of Congregation Shearith Israel, the oldest existing Jewish congregation in the New World. It was also the beginning of the separation of church and state in America. In the centuries to come, the city's greatest challenges and greatest strengths would always come from its astonishing diversity.
New York did not remain Dutch long. There's several reasons. One is it really was not the financial success that the Dutch had hoped for. Secondly, and more important, the British were establishing themselves both down in Virginia and moving north, in Massachusetts, especially around Boston, and coming south through Connecticut. And what the British noticed was there was this troublesome Dutch trading post in the middle of the British North American Empire.
Stuyvesant's tragedy is that no sooner does he get this place all spiffed up and ready for action than the English sail in and take the place.
On August 27, 1664, 4 heavily armed English warships sailed into the harbor. Peter Stuyvesant climbed painfully to the top of Fort Amsterdam and made ready for battle. I had rather be carried to my grave than surrender, he said. But before a shot could be fired, he was handed a petition that had been signed by 93 of the town's leading merchants, including his own son.
His citizens, only partly Dutch, looked at the guns of the British fleet, knew that they had a small little town which was made out of wood and closely built up, and that the British guns would have quickly reduced the city to a smoking ruin, and they implored Stuyvesant to turn over the city, which he did, and with drums beating and flags flying, he marched out of the fort.
He grumbled, but he had to surrender because the citizens of the town said, "We won't lift a finger to fight the English. Why would we care who ran this colony or who taxed us? We'd be perfectly happy to have the English. You haven't done much of a job."
In the years to come, Peter Stuyvesant, the man who first brought order to the city and thus assured its future, would retire to a sprawling fruit farm north of town, on open land that would one day become Greenwich Village. The English governor who replaced him graciously offered free passage back to Holland to any Dutch citizens unwilling to accept English rule. No one took him up on it. 2 days after the English takeover, on August 29, 1664, New Amsterdam was officially renamed New York, in honor of the Duke of York, the brother of King Charles, to whom the colony had been promised as a birthday present. The day after that, everyone went back to work, as if nothing much had happened after all.
New York did not remain Dutch long. There's several reasons. One is it really was not the financial success that the Dutch had hoped for. Secondly, and more important, the British were establishing themselves both down in Virginia and moving north, in Massachusetts, especially around Boston, and coming south through Connecticut. And what the British noticed was there was this troublesome Dutch trading post in the middle of the British North American Empire.
Stuyvesant's tragedy is that no sooner does he get this place all spiffed up and ready for action than the English sail in and take the place.
On August 27, 1664, 4 heavily armed English warships sailed into the harbor. Peter Stuyvesant climbed painfully to the top of Fort Amsterdam and made ready for battle. "I had rather be carried to my grave than surrender," he said. But before a shot could be fired, he was handed a petition that had been signed by 93 of the town's leading merchants, including his own son.
His citizens, only partly Dutch, looked at the guns of the British fleet, knew that they had a small little town which was made out of wood and closely built up, and that the British guns would have quickly reduced the city to a smoking ruin, and they implored Stuyvesant to turn over the city, which he did, and with drums beating and flags flying, he marched out of the fort.
He grumbled, but he had to surrender because the citizens of the town said, "We won't lift a finger to fight the English. Why would we care who ran this colony or who taxed us? We'd be perfectly happy to have the English. You haven't done much of a job."
In the years to come, Peter Stuyvesant, the man who first brought order to the city and thus assured its future, would retire to a sprawling fruit farm north of town, on open land that would one day become Greenwich Village. The English governor who replaced him graciously offered free passage back to Holland to any Dutch citizens unwilling to accept English rule. No one took him up on it. 2 days after the English takeover, on August 29, 1664, New Amsterdam was officially renamed New York, in honor of the Duke of York, the brother of King Charles, to whom the colony had been promised as a birthday present. The day after that, everyone went back to work, as if nothing much had happened after all.
One of the continuities between Dutch and English rule in colonial New York is this aggressive policy toward the Native American population. Clearly, the destruction of the Iroquois population and the Canarsie population in Manhattan and Long Island is a byproduct of British expansion in those areas. Daniel Denton, who in the 1660s writes one of the first English language histories of the region, or sort of general descriptions of the region, says something rather interesting. Everywhere that the English have gone, the invisible hand of God has prepared a space for them by destroying and removing the native population. My response to that is that men acted far more often than God, and it was the British who prepared that space. They destroyed the native population aggressively through war. They encouraged wars between Native American tribes and nations, and the spread of disease just really reduced a huge portion of this lower New York population.
In the end, it would be the fate of New York's original inhabitants to be remembered, when they were remembered at all, as placenames in what had become the most completely man-made environment on Earth. The Dutch and English had set in motion a process of change that would never stop until the entire human and natural landscape of Manhattan Island had been completely replaced. For the next 119 years, England would rule New York. What for the Dutch had been a second-rate outpost of empire was for the English the missing link in a chain of royal colonies stretching the length of the Atlantic seaboard. Slowly but surely, the new English governors brought the colony into the imperial system, reorganizing the lands around the harbor and naming them after members of the royal family. The flatlands around Brooklyn were named Kings County in honor of King Charles, and the region to the north, Queens, in honor of his wife, Catherine. Staten Island was named Richmond, after the Duke of Richmond, the king's bastard son. Though they did everything they could to ease the transition, the English found it no easier than the Dutch to keep order in the unruly colony. In 1689, a local merchant named Jacob Leisler led an armed uprising against the government. It was soon put down, and Leisler himself tried for treason and sentenced to be hanged, disemboweled while still alive, drawn and quartered, and then beheaded. A few years later, trouble erupted again when a new monarch, Queen Anne, placed her own cousin, an imperious viscount named Lord Cornbury, in charge of the volatile colony. Petitioning the Queen for his dismissal, Cornbury's enemies did everything they could to ruin his reputation, accusing him of embezzling public funds, persecuting Presbyterians, and it was later said, of having a special liking for women's clothing.
The story that's told is that he wanted to look as much like his cousin Queen Anne, for whom he was ruling the colony, as possible, and to do this, he dressed up in women's clothes and, to quote some early sources, flounced around the Battery. In fact, there's a portrait of him at the New York Historical Society dressed in a kind of a wasp waist blue number that's very nice indeed. And you walk by and you think, what an ugly woman. And then you go back and you realize that, no, it's in fact Lord Cornbury.
But for all the problems, membership in the British Empire brought enormous rewards, as England soon surpassed Holland as the greatest maritime empire on earth, and connected the colony to a network of trade that stretched around the globe.
The more trade routes are developed, the more this becomes a nexus point of flow between England and the Caribbean and the continent, the more people who are local domestic producers, who up till then have produced for a local market only, begin to say, whoa, there's serious possibilities here. This was a trading post. This was a place that was about shipping food down to the West Indies, bringing sugar and slaves back from the West Indies. But you can't run a mercantile operation without a manufacturing component. So in fact, you need coopers, you need barrel makers, you're going to have ships, you need shipyards. Ships, you need sails, you need sail makers, you need rope makers. So rope walks are sort of festooned all over New York City.
Year after year, the number of ships sailing out of New York Harbor surged upwards, from 35 a year at the end of Dutch rule to more than 700 a century later, exporting timber and grain to Britain carrying manufactured goods from England to Africa, and importing rum, molasses, and slaves from Africa and the West Indies. In 1699, the old Dutch wall was pulled down to make way for new houses, and a new lane paved over it, called Wall Street. By 1740, New York had become the third largest port in the British Empire, second only to Philadelphia and London itself. It was home now to an uneasy assortment of old Dutch families and English merchants, privateers and colonial administrators, Protestants and Catholics, free blacks, slave owners, and slaves.
While we'd like to think that by the 18th century, New York City was really a model of tolerance and everybody could get along, in fact, there's evidence that there was a lot of resentments, the Dutch versus the English, other groups coming in. The Jews were here, but they weren't really fully accepted. Blacks, of course, and African Americans were much the most discriminated against. But it was not a wonderful love fest going on in New York in the 1740s. In fact, there were a lot of fears.
In the winter of 1741, the royal colony exploded over an issue that had troubled it from the very start.
Well, of course, I think that what sets the African American experience apart from the other immigrants was we did not come through our side. We did not come escaping anything. We brought here against our will to work. And work we did. In fact, we built the wall, for which Wall Street is named. Not only literally, but figuratively, in terms of it was the trade in African flesh that provided the fundamental capital on which Wall Street, the financial one, is built. So yes, our experience is different.
Slavery is the key word. It's key not only in the fact that blacks are used as a public works infrastructure workforce. I mean, they build roads, they build ports, they build walls and the like. But more to the point, the city is raison d'etre at that point is about the connection to the Caribbean slave South and then later on to the mainland slave South. On the one hand, we've got this kind of business-oriented, cosmopolitan city. On the other hand, there's a profound cleavage, and it's based on the exploitation of slave labor.
Some white New Yorkers thought the practice barbaric. Slaveholding depraves the mind, one Quaker minister said, with as great certainty as cold congeals water. But year by year, as New York expanded, the demand for slaves grew. By 1740, 1 in 6 New Yorkers were owned by other New Yorkers, 2,000 men, women, and children in all. Each morning, African Americans could be seen strolling to the slave market at the foot of Wall Street, where they waited to be rented out for use as day laborers, exchanging news with free blacks and looking for every chance they could to break free.
There had been a variety of slave rebellions in the colonies, and I think that New Yorkers were very much aware of these slave rebellions. As the number of slaves increased, they were also very afraid that New Yorkers were at risk. They noticed slaves gathering together. They had put prohibitions on slaves meeting on street corners, but they knew that slaves were interested in gaining their freedom in any way that they could, and they were very fearful of open revolt.
Memories of a bloody slave uprising years before were still vivid in the minds of white New Yorkers, when in the winter of 1741, a series of mysterious fires began breaking out all over the city, burning the King's Chapel, the Army Barracks, and the homes and businesses of prominent New Yorkers. Suspicion quickly fell on the city's black population.
The recorder, taking notice of the several fires which have lately happened in this city, must necessarily conclude that they were occasioned by some villainous confederacy of latent enemies amongst us. Daniel Horseman.
March, as the authorities searched frantically for the guilty parties, an indentured servant named Mary Burton, prompted by the prospect of a $100 reward, came forward to testify against her employer, an Irish Catholic tavern keeper named John Hewson, whose establishment was a favorite meeting place for slaves and free blacks. She told wild tales of a Negro plot to burn the city and overthrow the government, leveling one charge after another against Hewson, his wife, and a growing list of alleged black conspirators.
One gets the feeling that Mary Burton forgot what the truth was. Her stories kept getting more and more elaborate as she implicated more and more individuals in the subversion, and she was absolutely convincing because the officials, the New York City officials, wanted to be convinced that this was a wider conspiracy.
There were levels of conspiracy that probably actually were invented by the people investigating conspiracy. So, for instance, the belief that Catholics, and particularly Irish Catholics, were responsible for creating this discontent among the slaves was probably an invention of Protestants looking to protect their self-esteem as masters and looking to reinforce their racial ideas that Africans were incapable of plotting against them on their own.
Some blacks had almost certainly been involved, but as the hysteria in Manhattan reached fever pitch, colonial judges ordered a massive roundup of black New Yorkers, and with almost no evidence, put them on trial for their lives. In the weeks to come, the reign of terror visited on blacks, and on anyone suspected of conspiring with them, would be worse than the Salem witch trials half a century before.
The real story of 1741 is, in fact, not what the slaves did, but in fact what was done to the slaves. The level of ferocity with which the insurrection was repressed, and then the punishments that were meted out, despite the fact that these were valuable pieces of property. People were burned at the stake. People were roasted over a slow fire for 8 hours, that the torment may be dragged out. Medieval tortures, which in fact had been utterly banned for conventional and white purposes, were in fact resurrected to strike terror into the hearts of the population.
Before it was over, 16 blacks and 4 whites had been hanged in New York. 13 slaves had been burned at the stake, and 70 more deported. It would take nearly a century more for black New Yorkers to win their freedom. But it would not be long before English rule was challenged again. Not by African Americans this time, but by the city's restless merchant middle class and an alliance of artisans and sailors. When that happened, the proud royal colony would begin a long journey out of empire, out of the past, and into the future.